Welcome to Native America Calling. I'm Sean Spruce. Cannupa Hanska Luger's graphic novel and art book is the latest project in a long creative career that weaves futuristic images with traditional themes, all geared toward increasing the visibility of Indigenous people and culture. At the same time, his work is on display in major institutions, including an augmented reality collection with other Indigenous artists at New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art. Luger is an acclaimed multidisciplinary artist, and he joins us after the news as our October Native in the Spotlight.
This is National Native News. I'm Brian Bull, sitting in for Antonia Gonzalez. Searches continue for two people missing from a western Alaska village after remnants of Typhoon Halong left one dead and much of the region devastated by high winds and flooding. But large-scale search and rescue efforts are largely on hold pending new information. The U.S. Coast Guard, Alaska State Troopers, and Alaska National Guard say they were unable to locate a floating house and its occupants before they suspended their active search Monday night. Coast Guard Captain Christopher Culpepper says the search covered dozens of square miles around the village of Kwigillingok, using helicopters, planes, drones, and more.
Suspending an active search is always a tough decision to make, and it is especially difficult in this situation where the Kwigillingok community is already suffering so much.
Alaska State Troopers identified the missing people as 71-year-old Vernon Paville and 41-year-old Chester Kashatuk, and said they had found the body of 67-year-old Ella Mae Kashatuk. All three lived in the hard-hit village of Kwigillingok and members of the same family. Bria Paul knew them well. She says she saw their house floating off its foundation as floodwaters rose on Sunday.
They were the most kindest people I've ever met. They didn't have much, but they always had a positive mindset, and they always greeted anyone. They welcomed everyone to their home. They deserve to be searched. Their names deserve to be heard.
A mass evacuation is underway for the communities of Kipnuk and Kwigillingok, where 1,000 people were sheltering in schools after Sunday's storm. On Wednesday and Thursday, hundreds of evacuees boarded planes bound for Anchorage at the Alaska Army National Guard hangar in Bethel. The city of Anchorage is preparing to welcome up to 2,000 people displaced by the catastrophic storm. Community members spent the day at the Wind River Tribal Buffalo Initiative headquarters on Indigenous Peoples Day. A workshop led by Northern Arapaho member Big Wind Carpenter had them making patties out of chokecherries.
This is like the best berry of all. It has cultural properties, it has spiritual properties. It's important that we continue this tradition because it's becoming lost. A lot of folks, they were walking over 5 miles a day. You would use this as, your original energy bar. There's like 5 mortar and pestles over here. You just throw this in there, about a handful, and you're gonna start just going for it. All right, who wants to try this out?
It's hard to tell if it's getting small enough.
So inside of the pit, there's a nut, and inside the nut is the fatty acids, right? Okay. On the exterior of that is this precursor to cyanide, essentially. So macerating it is what creates that smell. You get hints of vanilla and like all of these things, like the more you just keep going.
That's a really good one. Does it have to be flatter like that?
Yeah, flat.
I am putting some choke cherries down on this little piece of paper so that they'll dry out. I've kind of ground it into as fine of a paste as I can, but the seeds are quite hard, so it took some time.
Our participants have made 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 patties, and we had 5 people going making their little mortars.
The people then celebrated the 3rd annual Buffalo Bash, a night of music and food. It's the first bash since both tribes reclassified bison as wildlife. This story was produced by Wyoming Public Radio's Hannah Haberman. This is National Native News. I'm Brian Bull.
National Native News is produced by Koahnic Broadcast Corporation with funding by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Support by Drummond Woodsum, a full-service law firm whose nationally recognized tribal nations practice provides services to tribal nations and their enterprises and to companies that do business with tribes across the country. More at dwmlaw.com. Skugtash. For more than 40 years, Ramona Farms has revived ancient traditional foods, tepary beans, pinoli, polentas, and more, all from store.ramonafarms.com. Ramona Farms supports this show. Tomye.
Native Voice One, the Native American Radio Network.
This is Native America Calling. I'm Sean Spruce. One of multidisciplinary artist Cannupa Hanska Luger's most recent works is an object you can carry around in your back pocket. Surviva, a future ancestral field guide, is a hybrid art book and graphic novel. If you're familiar with Luger's work, you will recognize characteristic images that crop up in his sculptures and public art installations. The book is a creative interpretive of a survival guide for a type of fictional dystopian future. It's also a guide through his frequent artistic mission to disrupt preconceived notions of indigenous people and culture. On top of that, Luger has a piece in an augmented reality exhibition that opened on Indigenous Peoples Day at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And you could see his costume design for a terrifying character in the Jordan Peele horror film, Him. Luger is our native in the spotlight. If you have comments or questions for him, give us a call. The number to the Albuquerque studio, 1-800-996-2848. That number is also 1-800-99-NATIVE. Joining us now in the Albuquerque studio is Cannupa Hanska Luger. He is Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara, an enrolled member of the 3 affiliated tribes of Fort Berthold. He is also Lakota. Cannupa, it is a pleasure to have you on the show today. Welcome.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Let's start with your book, A Future Ancestral Field Guide. In the intro, I described it as a graphic novel / art book. Is that how you describe it?
Yeah. Yes. I think all of those descriptors have to land in the in the economic component of, like, how do you sell a book like this? How I describe it is, honestly, I wanted to make an art object that was part of the Future Ancestral Technologies kind of umbrella of work that I've been navigating that's accessible to my community. You know, at this point, my work it's expensive, you know, and because of my success, that actually creates a gap between my community and the work that I make. So I wanted to make something that held the story, the ethos, the conversation around future ancestral technology, and make it so that everybody can get it, you know, and have a part of this story, this narrative, this kind of like, tale, you know. And Surviva turns out to be a great kind of anchor to embed some of the, what would you call it? I guess like creative kind of ideas, the things that I wanted to kind of hash out and embed it into a book that is about survival. The survival guide, it's great at keeping the individual alive, the organism alive, but I think what's more important is culture. You know, culture needs to be a part of our experience to complete us as a whole being. And so Surviva, you know, hopefully anchors in that sort of thing. And you mentioned dystopic. I am not a dystopic futurist by any means. I truly believe that our survivance is the anchored kind of like lessons for human beings in general into the future. It may look different than it does right now, but right now looks pretty chaotic and upside down. So I'm like, this could actually be the antidote for our future existence.
Mm-hmm. This is interesting. And of course, the canvas of the book, it's an old Army field guide. How did you locate that? And what was the inspiration to transform it into this work of art?
Back in, I think it was 2017, my wife was on a project she was in Oregon, and she went to a Army surplus store and found all of these old field manuals. She brought 2 of them home. The aesthetic of these books is just like right up my alley, and she was like, "Oh, he'll love this." In a black, bold, capitalized Helvetica font on the front of it, it just says survival. And I'm like, and it's it's black and white. It looks like can of commodity luncheon meat or something like that. But survival is what it's serving. And I'm like, oh, I love the aesthetic of this. And she got me this book and another one that said booby traps on the front of it.
Oh, no.
And I was like, booby traps? Is that the term we're going to use for all of this? Anyway, I started going through the survival guide, and on I think it's page 5, there's one of those vertical poems, where a word is written and then there's texts, a sentence, a phrase that comes off of it, and it's the word survival. And as I'm reading through it, the S is size up the situation, the U is undue haste makes waste, the R is remember where you are, the V is vanquish fear and panic, the I is improvise, the next V is value living, and then the A is act like the natives. And I was like, what is in this book? So I start flipping through, and I find teepees, I find snowshoes, I find a variety of traps that my aunties and uncles showed me. I grew up seeing these tactics for survival as just customary things that come from Indian country, and you start looking at some of the plant medicines and the foods that you can eat and how to quarter up some game, how to field dress. And I was like, I need to fix this book. This book has gleaned indigenous knowledge, moved it through a hyper-militarized state, and then regurgitated it as a field manual through the Army. And my dad, being a veteran from the Vietnam era, I was like, this is probably the same field manual that was issued to him. And I started going through the book, and years later, this is 2017. I just published this book, and I went through each page, redacted a lot of the text. I worked with my publisher, who's a friend of mine I've known since 7th grade. His name's Eden Pearlstein. And he came up with this technique that he calls lifted, and we just went through the text with a highlighter and found lines throughout the book that were, really. It was there was a line that the margins of printing created that just kind of summed up the entire paragraph, and so we redacted everything but those lines. And an example of this is the first page. It's chapter 1, introduction. Purpose and scope, your wits, period. This is a major lesson in survival, period. Remember that,
Uh-huh. Well, I'll tell you, as a kid who grew up in the 80s, and I was a frequent shopper at a local military surplus store, I have seen those old Army field guides that you were working with. And I remember one time reading one of those, and it had this whole section on if you find yourself stranded or you are taken prisoner by an indigenous tribe. And there were all these tips about be very careful, they're very protective of their women, and all these do's and don'ts. And there were these really stereotypical drawings of indigenous people on an island. It was just crazy. But
that page is in my book. It's page 232. And it says natives, and then I redacted everything, and it just says don't, and then it could happen. The important question is how.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the concepts that you relate through this work, there was one part where you mentioned physical wounds and how in some ways the healing process is the same for emotional wounds. that we incur as people. And then there's also some statements that you repeat throughout the book. One of them is how to heal a wound that is still being cut.
Yeah.
Talk more about that, and what that means.
Well, this idea, this phrase, it came from, 2016, the Dakota Access Pipeline engagement. I'm back home in Standing Rock, where my family's from. I'm hauling materials from New Mexico all the way up to Standing Rock. I'm helping out in that region, doing what I can, using my privilege, as an artist to kind of bring awareness and flex as much as I can. And I just grew up hearing this lesson of like, you need to get over it. I remember hearing that around like the loss of land, the reservation period, like all of these traumas that we've experienced as Indigenous people. And the response is, that happened a long time ago. You need to get over it. And, it was 2016. And I was like, it's still happening. Like, why don't you get over it? That's my question. Like, when are you going to get over it? Because I don't know how to heal a wound that's still being cut. And, it doesn't end there. I saw it again years later during the migrant caravans, where folks were coming up from Central South America. These are all Indigenous people. And the response from the U.S. was the same that I saw at Standing Rock. They used the same tactics, the same militarized industries. And then now we're seeing it presently with ICE and in cities across the country. I'm like, man, they really don't like it when natives gather. This is how they respond over and over, So I'm like, how do you heal a wound that's still being cut?
How do you heal a wound that is still being cut? If you've got an answer to that question, you can give us a call, or if you would just like to talk with Cannupa Hanska Luger, ask him a question. Maybe you are a fan of his artwork and you just want to tell him how much you admire what he does. Give us a call, 1-800-996-2848. That number is also 1-800-99-NATIVE. That'll connect you to our studio in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and you can join the conversation. We're talking today with our October Native in the Spotlight multidisciplinary artist, Cannupa Hanska Luger. After authorities evacuated more than 1,000 people from villages on the west coast of Alaska following major storms and historic flooding, the fate of those villages that are subjected to increasing storm threats remains an unanswered question. We'll hear about ongoing relief efforts on the next Native America Calling.
The Association on American Indian Affairs invites all to Tribal Museums Day, December 6th through December 12th. Tribal museums may offer no-cost or reduced admission, gift shop discounts, art markets, and live cultural demonstrations. Tribal Museums Day honors diverse Native nations as the experts of their own cultures. You can find a map of tribal museums and more at indian-affairs.org/Tribal Museums Day. The association supports this show.
Thank you for listening to Native America Calling. We are talking with our Native in the Spotlight for this month, Cannupa Hanska Luger, today. His work is celebrated in galleries, museums, and public art spaces across the globe. If you have questions or comments for Cannupa Hanska Luger, what are you waiting for? Give us a call. Join the conversation. We're at 1-800-996-2848. That number is also 1-800-99-NATIVE. Cannupa, we've got so much to talk about because your art extends so much beyond just this new graphic novel. You have installations in many public spaces. In one instance, you have even inundated Times Square in New York City. Do you have a different mindset when it comes to public art in terms of the messages you send?
Public art is it's an interesting form for artists to engage with. there is the scale of the work. Sometimes you have to rely on other people to produce and fabricate the work, safety protocols, all of these sorts of things. But the public space is, maybe the most equitable of spaces. But then you also have to take into consideration, like, who is the community around this space? Like, usually the folks who fund these sorts of things aren't necessarily living in close proximity to the public space that the work is being produced. So you just have to be aware of all of those sorts of things, engage, try to understand what place is. But as an artist, I'm really interested in how you develop work for place. Each site has its own stories, its own protocols, its own taboos, and I think there's an advantage from an indigenous lens of being able to ask, engage with people, and understand that there are these sorts of things that are hyper place based. Now, Times Square, what's the culture? What's the people of that area? That was a strange one. It was primarily video, 92 videos taking place in Times Square, and it was at midnight all through the month of April last year or this year. It was interesting though because they had to test it like a week before I got to see it. So then I flew out and we did programming around the presentation of the work, and it still didn't feel real. Like for some reason, all of those screens. It was raining the day of the opening for us, and I'm also an '80s kid, and I grew up with it just reminded me of Blade Runner. Of this rain, these screens. Even though I was standing there, it still sat in this really strange kind of surreal aspect.
Wow. Is there a public arena that you'd really like to create an installation that you haven't provided one for yet?
No, not necessarily. I mean, I like making. My studio. I'll hire out folks now and again to help me produce work, but by and large, my hand is involved in the creation of almost everything, and so the public artwork it removes my hand from the production, the making of the work. So I don't put a whole lot of focus on it until I can figure out a way to actually engage and be a part of the creation of the work. But I mean, I don't know. There's any number of places that I would love to generate some sort of disruption or allow people to imagine alternatives to the spaces that they inhabit. And public spaces, that's a good space to do that. I have to build up the skill sets to what would you call it, delegate tasks, I guess. There's many artists who are really good, who work with teams and are good at delegating tasks, and I'm so I haven't yet developed the skill sets to have a solid delegation of tasks.
Well, it sounds like having the vision to create something and then actually managing it through and implementing that are probably two very different skills in many ways.
Yeah, they are for sure. And there are people who excel at both of those things. I like an idea, but I think material tells me a lot in the process of making it. So if I don't learn from material through the process of creation, I don't feel like I grow at all as an artist. So when I outsource the production of work, it doesn't. I don't feel like I really gained anything other than the exposure of an idea. Mm-hmm. I like making.
Well, then there are some artists too who, they send the plans, everything to some kind of a subcontractor, and ultimately all they do is sign it. That happens in some cases.
Yeah, so that's true. And if there's a market for it and people are willing to support that, I don't have anything against that. I'm mm-hmm. like you should totally do that. There is a project that I am working on that is coming into fruition. That is a public artwork that it's going to be a long project to figure out, but I'm working on a Buffalo Nation monument. I actually want to build a war memorial for bison in relationship to their annihilation. I don't think we really get to understand the scale of that loss unless we can comprehend the scale of their being. And 30 to 60 million bison is a number that is hard to comprehend. And I want to build a monument that allows our general population to understand the scale of that loss so that we can understand and appreciate their return, And I don't think we have a good way for them to return without understanding in totality their absence.
Where do you want to place that monument?
This is the thing that I'm about to get started on is I don't know. I don't think I should be the one to decide. So I'm starting this project, which is mostly an R&D, research and development, and I'm actually trying to build a network of folks who are in the business of bison rematriation on the land, either through environmental or ecological angles, and simultaneously, I'm interested in the economy of it and folks who work with buffalo as food or something along those lines, and also between native and non-native communities who are doing this sort of work. Like there's a lot of people doing a lot of this work, and I'm trying to help build a bridge between all of those so that buffalo benefit from all of these different angles of engaging with bison back in North America. And with that being said, there are so many voices, so many people who've been doing work for generations around that I don't think it should be left to an individual artist to decide where that monument exists and even what that monument looks like. Like I have an idea in my head, but if it ends up being exactly what I think, I believe I've probably failed somehow as an artist,
Cannupa, you used the term disruption earlier, and we hear that a lot on this show, but it's a good segue into another one of your projects. I want to talk about the Mirror Shield project at the Standing Rock pipeline protests, and that was an obvious statement. There were shields held by hundreds of water protectors that had mirrors facing law enforcement officers. And now, in retrospect, these many years later, what else do you think that piece tells us in terms of what that protest meant? And again, thinking about where we are today as Native people.
Yeah, that piece I disguised as an art project. I just wanted to get shields in the hands of people on the front line, and the idea of them being mirrors was, you watch media, you hear about everything going on up there, and it lands as protest, and I'm like, dude, we're not protesting oil, we're just really for water, and that's different. You generate this notion of protest, and you reinforce this idea of antagonist or combatant, and then the response gets to be accelerated, right? So when you're for something, I'm like, this is water for everybody. Water is the first medicine. Water is for sharing. Like even these folks on the other side in riot gear, they need water. So they're pretty much on our same side. So here is this mirror that actually reflects them and puts them on our front line as well, and allows them to see what we're seeing, and I think that's the real secret to this work was that, I had to disguise it as art because I had to ask myself a question: is a shield a weapon? And at the time that this was being deployed at Standing Rock, they were confiscating anything deemed weapon. So that was, everything from propane tanks to, for cooking to canned food, anything that was deemed that. And I was like, yeah, if under those standards, I think maybe a shield is a weapon, So how do I use my privilege and disguise these as an art project? It's funny because it's been celebrated more so as an art object than than its primary design function. And, for me, I made it so that people had something to do beyond thoughts and prayers and likes and shares. I was like, you can make this shield. You can do it. It's $60 worth of material. It's a little bit of your time and your effort. And if you can't send, a capital, or you can't help in that sort of way, you might be able to do this. And I built it in the parking lot of a big box store, And I was like, you don't even need a facility. This is a pretty easy thing to create. And I think that's the most creative, artistic part of the piece, is that it gave people something to do beyond thoughts and prayers. I'm looking at social media and I'm like, this is a river that is wide and shallow. So I'm like, how can we build empathy? How can we encourage people? How can we utilize this system to actually get people to participate beyond the minimum?
Big box store parking lots, large metropolitan installations in the U.S. and Canada, rural landscapes in the desert, in the high plains. Cannupa, are there any places, though, where you won't let your art be featured?
I don't know if I even get to decide that. There's a part of me that, strongly disagrees with the kind of like capitalist consumerist models that we live under the burden of. But I'm an artist, and like the work that I do, the industry of art is an incredibly toxic industry. My work in its most cynical, becomes like safety deposit boxes for the uber rich, and like, is there a space that isn't also funded with that? Is there a dollar that isn't dirty already? Like, I don't know. So I have to ask myself, what do you do with those privileges? What do you do? How do you liberate capital from these systems to actually try to do something better with it? Because it's a fluid system. It'll go back into itself over and over and over again. And any amount that you can siphon off and produce and create work might not be a fragment grenade. Might not be a pipeline or a train line. So I have a hard time with this. I'm like, yeah, who wouldn't I mess with? I don't know. Mm-hmm. It's a challenging question.
Well, it's interesting how you mention perhaps challenges with wealthy, powerful, private art patrons. But what about with regard to public monies that support art? And even now with this push to change the direction of publicly funded art and media, how are you responding to that?
It's interesting to me because of how I grew up and where I come from. I'm like, oh, you're going to take away funding to create work? Like that has ever stopped artists ever in the history of human beings, So it's fascinating. But I think in these instances, it allows the population to understand the value of work differently. Right now, the markets decide the value of the work, and they have no comprehension of the cost. But if that's removed, the value will probably shift around art, and it might be the population that understands first what it means to live in a place without access to these creative forms, and then they'll generate their own value system around that. And the general population, we understand the cost of work, what it means to spend that time. Where does that time come from? As an artist, and I'm successful. Like, there's no question in this. But the cost of making the work is time away from my family. I have a wife. I have 2 boys. The time that I spend in the studio is time that I'm not spending with them. And so you start to ask yourself, like, what is the value of this? If somebody buys this for $3 billion, is it worth not having that time with your family, and suddenly the question, between value and cost begins to shift. And I think that there is a possibility in the world of public funding being removed from some of these systems, where our general public begins to understand that value cost relationship and build safeguards for their own community, their immediate community. It might not be nationwide, but it might be within each individual community where we understand the value because we better understand the cost.
Cannupa, we're going to take another break here, and you mentioned just briefly, having grown up. So I want to ask you a little bit about your upbringing and your family as well, and how you have drawn inspiration throughout your life. But of course, we do have to take this short break. And as always, I want to encourage our listeners today, give us a call. We've got the phone lines open, and we would love to hear from some listeners today. Looks like we do have one caller already on the line. So when we come back from this break, we'll go ahead and take that first caller, and let's get some more going as well. The number is 1-800-996-2848. Again, 1-800-996-2848, or just 1-800-99-NATIVE. And of course, you can always use the social media. I think Cannupa described it as being very broad, but sometimes very thin. So maybe we'll put some density there with some comments here on our social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, Threads. Tell us what you like about this show. Tell us what interests you about our guest today, Cannupa Hanska Luger. And of course, stay with us because we've got a lot more to talk about, and we will be right back.
Support by Sonosky Chambers Law, championing tribal sovereignty and Native American rights since 1976. From opioids litigation to treaty rights to tribal self-governance. With offices in Washington, D.C., New Mexico, California, and Alaska. Sonosky Chambers Law.
Skugtash. For more than 40 years, Ramona Farms has revived ancient traditional foods, tepary beans, pinoli, polentas, and more, all from store.ramonafarms.com. Ramona Farms supports this show. Omnie.
You've got it tuned to Native America Calling, and there is plenty of time to join our discussion today with artist Cannupa Hanska Luger. What draws you to artistic expression that combines indigenous tradition with contemporary messages? The number to call is 1-800-996-2848. We've got a caller on the line right now. This is Mel, who is listening in Albuquerque, New Mexico on KUNM Radio. Hello, Mel. You're on the air.
Howdy. Thanks for being there. Thanks to Cannupa. I really appreciate all of that he's talking about, especially that thing about get over it. Why don't you get over it? I'm African American. I've got Native on both sides. I'm Irish, and I'm really happy that the thing about why don't you get over it, talking about the male supremacist privilege that's running around all about. And I really am very interested and curious about Cannupa's and anyone's really understanding of what place the buffalo had. I'm looking at them as being the keystone for the ecology, the pre-Columbian ecology, and now we have all these ecological issues. People try and talk about ecological baselines, and without the buffalo, I'm not sure that concept even exists. So my question to everyone, especially Cannupa, is like, where are we at with understanding what do our traditions tell us about the centrality that the buffalo might have had in an ecological sense?
Yeah, thank you. Let's see. Thank you for that question.
That's a big question.
It is.
Well, maybe we can condense it a little bit. Go ahead and answer that, but I also think maybe just talk about how you take a big issue
Yeah.
like bison extermination, and how you weave that down into a single piece of art or maybe a series of artworks. How do you condense that?
Well, I firmly believe that condensing, reducing, these are all tactics of a colonial kind of mind frame. Like we go to a museum to understand a culture, but we get a fraction of it. We get these kind of broad strokes around the whole thing. But the fact of the matter is, it's complex. And the more complex it is, actually, the closer we are to better understanding that. And I think this ecological component is an important factor. I'm from the Northern Plains, like the prairie grasslands. These are one of the most depleted and disappearing biomes in North America. And he's absolutely right. The removal of bison has a lot to do with that. Bison were yes, an apex species, but they were, it wasn't just because of their scale and their numbers, but because of what they did. They were an incredible, technologically advanced creature as far as technology being an idea, not the mechanisms that we sell and celebrate presently, but ideas. Buffalo spent a lot of time really thinking about what it means to move across a landscape, build a population that's, upward of 60 million. At the time before their annihilation, they were the single largest biomass on the planet Earth. And this is buffalo. So how do they become successful? What is that source of success? Well, their hair carried seed, their hooves splayed open. This is a deep time relationship to the landscape that they traversed. They helped kind of engineer that landscape. Their wallows became sources for water to pool and new foods and grasses and medicines to grow across the plains. So they bring these unique stories and tales to what it means to be another one of the amazing species on the planet. But it's intermingled. So with their removal, it begins this tropic cascade, that allots for everything from barbed wire and huge monocropping fields and systems like that. Like none of this was possible with 60 million buffalo roaming North America. So there was a decisive move to remove them, also as like a war of attrition against Northern Plains tribes who were reliant on buffalo, who understood the value of buffalo and what they were, not just as a resource, but with reverence, looking at them, learning how they move through the landscape. And if I could emulate that in any sort of way, then there is a chance of success in this environment, So how do you have those sorts of conversations, and how do you inform a general population who has no relationship to more than human kinship, who has no relationship to buffalo other than state parks and mascots, and I think this is the trick and the challenge. And I think the complexity is how you reach more and more people, because there may be groups that you miss who have focus in some of the narrower angles of buffalo's relationship to North America and to the land.
I want to talk, you mentioned mascots. I want to talk more about that, and especially the work you've done for the Jordan Peele horror film that came out this year, him. But first, I do want to ask you, tell me more about your upbringing. I know you have maintained a lifelong connection to the Institute of American Indian Arts.
Yeah, I went to school at the Institute of American Indian Arts between 2006 and 2011. Met a lot of my dear friends out here. Also, it was an interesting time at the school. While I was going to school there, it was under construction for the amazing facilities it has now. We had dirt lots and tractors kind of moving things around quite a bit. But I think that there's, what that school has now and has always had is its student body. That was the first time that I had gone to school with other Native students who weren't all the same tribal group as me. you know? And it actually opened up my eyes to things that you know, I thought were strange, but I didn't really fully comprehend, like, you know, even the term Native American, you know, I'm like, what is that? You know, what does that mean? When you're going to school and you're all the same tribe, Native American is a fine umbrella term. But when you're going to a school where there are, you know, 70 plus 100 different tribal groups represented, you start recognizing the vast distance between cultures, you know, and then you're like, okay, so Native American means this, all of us, you know, and I'm like, yeah, but we're so different. Like, it's such a strange engagement. And then I also started to notice and recognize weird, like, phenotypical traits, you know. I'm 6'3", you know, but I'm Northern Plains, and I'm like not necessarily a tall guy from up there, but down here in New Mexico, I'm tall, you know, and but then there's no advantage of height in the mountains, you know, no advantage at all. So you see these selections that have taken place between cultures and culture groups. And I was like, wow, the land has not only informed our cultures, but also our form. And then that makes me think a lot. I mean, as an artist working and engaging all over the place, like, I'm like, you better pay attention to place. Like, place has been the anchor that has informed what culture looks like, what people look like, what the environment, you know, it's all entangled. So how do you have that relationship? And, you know, that's IIA, but I grew up. My mother's an artist, Kathy Whitman, elk woman. She moved us off the reservation from North Dakota into the Southwest when I was young. I went to Indian Market. I was, you know, I joke around with some of my peers who were all like, we called ourselves booth babies. You know, we like grew up underneath those tables, listening to our parents answer the same question over and over and over again to the people collecting work, you know. I don't know. It's interesting. I have a relationship to New Mexico through that, but I go back home to North Dakota. My family is responsible for a ceremony that we take care of every year. So I have 2 kids who were born here in New Mexico, but that gives me a reason to go back home. My father and my brothers, they work a ranch in Standing Rock that my family's had, you know, there for a few generations now. So there is always an anchor that brings me back home, but also, like, you know, if your dad's a cowboy and your mom's an artist, you have to start to, like, really question which one works harder, you know, and that value of hard work is embedded in my practice to present, you know.
Cannupa, before we talk about the Jordan Peele horror film Him, let's take another caller. This is Hazel, who is listening on WOJB in Wisconsin. Hello, Hazel. How you doing? You're on the air.
Just fine. I tuned in late, but I was touched by the words of that when you communicate, when you present images or words, that you're hoping not to make a wall between some of the people that might be present in the same place. And I thought of an activist, humorist, artist, Walt Brissett from Red Cliff here in Wisconsin, and he always felt like he had failed. Like if he was talking with a group of non-native people about Columbus Day, he felt he had failed if they didn't all feel that they were like on the earth together. And it kind of made me think of using that word water too, just how difficult it is to not include anger or reproach to get one's communication to everybody. And thank you.
Thank you, Hazel, for calling in from La Coudray, Wisconsin. Cannupa, maybe a brief comment or response, and then we'll talk about the horror film.
Yeah, thank you, Hazel. For sure. I think there is a lot of, you know, the anger is not the actual feeling that you're feeling, right? Like you're sad, you're scared, you're having these different feelings, and anger is the easiest one to respond with. And I found that aggressive language or those sorts of tactics actually triggers defense mechanisms in your audience to protect themselves. So either they start to fade away, not pay attention, ignore. I've found the power of humor to be really strong in that sense, to engage with people. But also I found by getting people to do something while you have a conversation about that, where you get their hands actively operating on something, participating in the creation of something, working on something, their mental defense mechanisms also fall off, and then people start having real honest conversations. So I mentioned that, but I would also say that there is, as you know, from artists, like failure is the primary source of growth for any artist. And like I don't know if I've ever met an artist who's looked at a piece that they have created with total and complete success. You know, it's always like it could be better, you know, and maybe as a cartoonist, that, you know, that failure that they may feel is actually what drives them to do a better job next time.
Okay. Now you have created a sports mascot for a horror film. Tell us what drew you to this project, and tell us about this mascot.
Yeah, well, I mean, okay, first and foremost, we keep mentioning Jordan Peele. Jordan Peele's production company made it, but Justin Tipping was the director of this film, him. And Dominique Dawes was the costume designer, coordinator for the overall film. And some of my work came up as a I don't know, it was on their vision board for what they wanted these characters to look like. And when she realized the film was being produced here in New Mexico, and when she realized that I was actually local, she reached out. And what I made for the piece was this large crocheted cowboy hat and these big fringy gloves for the character of Tinsel Larry. And Tinsel Larry he's basically like a giant cheerleader's pom-pom, you know, with a cowboy hat and gloves. And the team was called the Saviors. And, you know, I was prompted with all of these ideas around the conversation around mascotry. And I wanted to participate. I wanted to participate in the creation of a mascot, but like play around with the ideas of what that looks like when you reduce a character to a caricature, you know. And Dominique Dawson, as a you know, costume designer, had these ideas and told me a little bit of a backstory around the team and the name and the impact of mascotry. And you know, we, in Indian country, we're hyper aware of this because we're asking people to recognize that we are not a costume, we are not a caricature, you know. And so I thought it would be interesting to have a Native person make a cowboy, you know, caricature for this football team, but then also run into the strangeness of like the name of the team and what this character symbolizes. For me, I thought it was fun to make this work. But you know, the fact of the matter is, I made it like over a year ago. You know, the film's just now coming out, but like I had like a couple of weeks to produce these pieces. And it's funny, like as a visual artist and you know, making work and things like that, the timelines are, you know, I'm aware of the timelines. I'm hyper aware of them. But with film, you know, there's production houses, you know, there's all of these other things that go into the factor of it. So it's out there now, you know.
Cannupa, brother, I'm sorry, we're out of time. We got to wrap this thing up.
Okay.
But hey, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. Keep in touch, okay? We'd love to bring you back on and just hear about all your projects and what you got going on in the future.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for joining us.
Big thanks to Cannupa Hanska Luger, our October Native in the Spotlight. We will be back next week with another lineup of discussions about more Indigenous issues and topics. Have a safe weekend. I'm Sean Spruce.
Now more than ever, the supporters of this and all Native One programs deserve a little extra love. Learn more about all our public radio underwriters and web-based sponsors at kowanik.org/supporters-spotlight. Support for journalism that raises the awareness of child well-being to citizens and to policymakers provided by the Annie E. Casey Foundation, building a brighter future for children, families, and communities. Information at aecf.org.
Hey, isto man ko hot wea ke tenam awa na kap to banisi ke nawa. Yam to da ko amos awa shu ap to ki kwat ko is breast cancer screening there to the mati da panna. Asta tayu yan kanihan to this healthcare.gov/coverage could awa nan ta isto 1-800-318-2596 sa pedanaken up to. Look here, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services to na pedanito lo ke nawe. Ela kwa.
Native America Calling is produced in the Annenberg National Native Voice Studios in Albuquerque, New Mexico by Kowanik Broadcast Corporation, a Native nonprofit media organization. Funding is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting with support from the Public Radio Satellite Service. Music is by Brent Michael Davids. Native Voice One, the Native American Radio Network.